We are back for another Expert Advisor review, and I'm very excited about this one. Today we're looking at the ORB Master by Profalgo Limited, which is Wim's company, and this is really exciting for two reasons. First of all, ORBs are one of my favorite strategies. They work exceptionally well, and I'm rather knowledgeable about ORB strategies, so I should be able to break down what he's doing. And second of all, Wim is he's the godfather of expert advisor development. Everybody knows that he's an extremely accomplished developer, and I'd say almost every developer in this industry has a tremendous amount of respect for his abilities. So when he puts out a bot, usually it's cool to see because we can all usually learn something from it. So starting us off here, what is an opening range breakout? Opening range breakout is quite simply taking advantage of the volatility created at a market open to develop a trading strategy with an edge. So how I usually trade it personally is around, let's say, the New York market open on the Dow Jones, the US 30, you can place a collar. So a buy stop at the high and a sell stop at the low. And quite often you'll see a breakout during this time period because there's all this order flow which is built up, which is executed at the open. So a great example of this would be market upon open orders, where you have a bunch of institutional players and even retail players which have instructed their brokers to buy or sell at the open. And this quite often leads for a massive surge either up or down. And you can capitalize on this with a whole bunch of different strategies. So the most classic is a collar. Some people also wait for the first X amount of candles to form and then trade the breakout of that range. I have a bot that does that too in the NASDAQ. And there's quite a few different methods of trading this. Some people like to look for the first 5-minute candle, the first 15-minute candle, but realistically, it's all the same premise that holds true, that this time, the open, can either be more of a volatility play where you have a big spike, or it can be seen as something that sets the direction or sets the bias for the day. So there's a few different ways of trading it, but it's very much a real strategy, and it's one of the oldest, most rigorously tested styles of strategies. So cool to see that Wim is coming up with it. So here what he's saying is that it's trading a whole bunch of different assets. So he's trading S&P 500, US 30, NASDAQ, and DAX. What I found personally is that the US 30 and the DAX work really well with more of the breakout style where you have a collar, just because the volatility is usually pretty high and the spreads are super low relative to the volatility of the asset. Whereas I find on the NASDAQ, it's usually better to hold for a longer period of time. Like the basic buy stop, sell stop collar, I have yet to find out how to make that work on the NASDAQ, but the NASDAQ works really well in that you can essentially wait, or you can enter at the break of the high and then hold until end of day and close. That works phenomenally well on the NASDAQ. I have yet to figure out how to make this work on the S&P, but I'm sure there's a way to do it as well. Most likely similar to the NASDAQ, where it's more of a longer hold period, but your entry is at the open. And what's quite cool here is that he's trading both across European markets as well as US markets. So I'm curious to see if he's only entering the DAX during the more European session and he's entering the US ones more later in the day. That's what I do personally, but curious to see his approach here. And what he's saying once again is that it all runs on the M15 time frame on Euro USD, but you have to input the broker's symbols appropriately so it can trade the full basket. So instead of giving you a bunch of different set files, what he's doing here is he's putting them all on in one bot, and you have the full portfolio in one EA, which is an interesting approach. I personally prefer to split them up just because it makes it easier to isolate performance on a bot by bot basis. And particularly with prop trading, I find it's a bit more convenient because then you can only do one trade per day and it makes risk management a lot easier. But for personal accounts, I can see why this approach would hold merit, particularly as some people get kind of confused if you give them too many set files. So this approach most likely is quite user-friendly. And now let's go up here, and the rest of it is pretty solid. He's talking about his approach where he's doing forward testing. He's not using any sort of high risk martingale style strategy, entering with a TP and a stop loss. And at the same time, if we go through some of the kind of about me sections here, he's saying that he doesn't like to use AI in his strategies, and he's based more on a solid technical foundation. So from my own experience here, you always need to have that solid technical foundation. However, some developers do use AI really intelligently to complement their bots. Like Brandon would be the perfect example of this. He's done some amazing work there. I use it more as a sentiment filter. I've seen some success there too. So regardless, what this is saying is WIM believes more in using a solid, technical, statistically back-tested approach, which makes a lot of sense. And I'm not going to go through all of these exact parameters here because it's not a super good use of our time today, but I'm sure you can go through this if so inclined. So to run it, you will have to pick the M15 on the euro dollar. You should also use the world time server when running it live. This is cool. I need to put this in some of my bots because times confuse everybody. Like, believe it or not, brokers sometimes use different time offsets. So like XNES uses a different time offset than IC Markets. And if you have a bunch of users, if you don't use a time server, people have to update the times. And it's a massive pain to chase people and be like, guys, update the times. So this is really smart and it's a great point of feedback for me because it will significantly reduce my customer support emails. But I can see why he's doing this and I actually should definitely dig into that for myself. So real strategy, the actual entries and exits which he's using, I would venture they're most likely based on his style of trading, which is more like placing many pending orders in zones, which is kind of WIM's proprietary method of doing breakout systems. That's probably his entry. And then usually his exits are based on a variety of different trailing stops put together. We don't have a signal here yet because it's new, but most likely it's going to come up in relatively short order. He also has developed so many good bots over the years that I think he's just a trustworthy guy, and most people recognize that if he publishes something, it's probably going to be quite solid. So overall, really good strategy. I like orbs. They work very well. They're very robust. There's a real logical premise behind why they work, as well as clearly he's a marquee developer, so most likely it's going to be quite good. But now let's dive into MT5 because I'm actually pretty curious about how it's actually deciding to trade. So we can see here, if we have a nice equity curve, but nothing insane. Here we're running it on, I ran it with every tick based on real ticks on Vantage. The history quality is not amazing. However, from my experience, WIM's bots all run on 1 minute open, high, low, close, just because they're triggered based on the 1 minute candle. They're not triggered based on ticks. So it's less relevant in this case. We're seeing around a 120% annual return with a 5% drawdown. So these are excellent metrics, but they're also not too good to be true, especially because he's taking more of a portfolio approach. We're seeing roughly a 50% win rate with a 2-to-1 risk reward, which is quite interesting because oftentimes orbs are more scalpy in nature. And if you make them more scalpy, you will typically see an inverted risk reward. So this kind of strengthens my view that WIM is not using a traditional breakout caller approach. He's using more his proprietary method of stacking orders. So now let's look at the actual deals. And yeah, we can see that he's trading a whole bunch of different assets. And if we look at the times, we can see that the US assets are trading more in the US session, whereas the DAX here is trading more in the German session, which makes sense because the DAX has a hugely strong impulse at Frankfurt Open. It's usually one of the most violent out there, whereas the US assets, obviously, it's more around US Open. That's why the volatility-based play, which are buy stop, sell stop, those work phenomenally well for the DAX and for the US 30, whereas some of his other ones here are based more on a bit of a different style. So actually, yeah, interestingly enough, we're seeing some of them are hitting stop loss and take profit, and some of them are closing, oh, sorry, no, these are orders, and some of them are closing in different ways, which is interesting. But yes, clearly, like if we look at the times here, we can see that many of them are opening at the market opens of the respective equity markets, which makes total sense. So now let's run a visual back test because I'm curious to see how he's actually managing the trades. This might take a few seconds to run. Here we go. Oh, okay. He's trading the DAX. I guess it's the first one. Come on. And his take profits are relatively generous. Like they're not they're not as tight as you would often see with orbs. And we're seeing that he's placing many orders in kind of his proprietary style. Let me find an hourly chart or an M15 somewhere on the Dow Jones. And I will fast forward a little bit here. There we go. So yeah, it's classic pending orders with trailing stop losses, which are pretty common, but he's also using expiring orders. Let me see, deal performed, order modified. Some of them appear to be expiring too, which would make sense. Here we go. Oh wow, he's trading the DAX probably the most aggressively. Yeah, the DAX I've found with orbs does trigger the most. Okay, he's also stacking orders here too. Let's try the DAX on the M15 to get some more insights. Here we go. Okay, there we go. Open up fairly soon. He is stacking orders as well. Okay, so yeah, he's definitely taken almost a whim approach to it, where he's not using a singular entry, he's stacking multiple orders on it, but he's also placing these orders right prior to the market open, so that he's able to probably have the best entry driven by the volatility of the market open. And I believe he's taking profit with a trailing stop. So that was an example of a loss. So let's fast forward a bit too. Okay, yeah, there's trailing stop losses there. So one thing to note is that the problem with this kind of system when you're running many many like correlated markets together is that in the event that all equity markets suddenly start ranging simultaneously, your total performance could have a more hefty drawdown because they are correlated markets. And this is why I personally usually like to separate them in different set files with different EAs, so you can always pull off one or the other. But I think he gives you the option of actually shutting off the different markets here. It's like if you want to run the DAX, run the NASDAQ, just something to be mindful of, that if you're trading many correlated markets, you have to sometimes adjust your risk to take into account that they can all move together. But overall, this looks to be a really good bot. So it's running the whim style, which is like stacking multiple orders at highs and lows, using different methods of actually managing the positions, which is pretty cool. He's taking more like larger take profits and larger stop losses, which would be kind of more indicative of his style. So he's not doing a true scalper. It's moving more based on the 1 minute candles. Also makes a lot of sense. And overall, a really interesting style of system. So I believe this was originally kind of inspired by his ultimate breakout system, and he's kind of moved over a lot of those stylistic preferences to this bot. But overall, looks really solid, based on a real strategy. It's kind of the whim take on the orb, which is pretty cool to see. And yeah, I think if you buy this, you probably would be extremely satisfied with it, particularly at $200 from one of the best developers out there. So yeah, looks really good. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.